We are waiting to see what happens at all of the ports along the East Coast beginning this evening. That's because the Longshoremen, who handle moving all of those containers to and from ships, are threatening a strike at this hour. And President Biden is not attempting to stop it, it appears. He's broadly claiming that they have some sort of negotiation underway, and that's it. He was actually asked a question about strikes in Yemen this weekend, and here's how he answered that question.
Any comment on the strikes in Yemen, Mr. President?
Both sides have got to settle the strike. Support the collective bargaining effort. I think they'll settle the strike.
I've talked to both sides. They're going to settle the strike. I'm supporting the collective bargaining effort. I think they'll settle the strike. I don't think that has anything to do with Yemen. That's Joe Biden talking about this. His administration has been spectacularly bad at tackling this issue. In fact, this weekend, Gina Raimondo, the Commerce Secretary, was asked on CNBC about this, the potential of a strike by the Longshoremen. And she says, well, I haven't really been focused on that.
Where have you been kind of focused and hearing on what would happen if the strike goes, let's say, longer than a week?
Again, I have not been very focused on that.
I have not been very focused on that, she says. We're looking at damage due to that strike, should it take place. JP Morgan estimates between $3.8 to $4.5 billion in economic damage per day. Well, let's dive even deeper into the numbers now with EJ Antoni. He's economist at the Heritage Foundation and the in-house economist of this show, the Vince Coglianese Show. EJ, good to have you back with us, sir.
Vince, great to be back. Thanks for having me again.
This is not a small deal, is it?
No, not at all. And, that estimate that you just read out from JP Morgan, that's accurate, but only, frankly, for a few days. The problem is that the longer this goes on, Vince, it will exponentially build. People think, well, let's say ports are shut down a day, then we're going to have a backlog of a day worth of imports and exports. No, it builds, and pretty significantly. And so you very quickly get to a point where adding each additional day to a strike like this can add a week of delays worth in terms of imports and exports entering and leaving this country. And I mean, frankly, this is the same Secretary of Commerce that we just heard that clip from when she was asked about the massive downward revision of over 800,000 jobs to the nation's economy recently. She simply responded by saying, oh, I'm just not familiar with that data. If she's not familiar with data on jobs and she's not focused on commerce, what is our Commerce Secretary even doing?
Well, yet another cabinet official who deserves to be fired, quite obviously, given answers like that. I do see some of the numbers here, and they're staggering. You mentioned, of course, the second-order effects of a strike and how much that'll disrupt the nation's supplies coming in. We're talking 45,000 workers who could all of a sudden all go on strike, 36 ports up and down the eastern seaboard, and 40% of all containerized goods in the United States. This will have a deep impact. It seems like even beyond what we experienced during COVID, EJ.
Oh, absolutely. And this is where I think people really underestimate just how reliant we have become on things like intermodal transport. So that's where you have these containers that can easily be loaded onto ships and then put on a truck or put on a train. And you can go around the world in these things without having to actually transfer all of the cargo from container to container to container. So it really has streamlined things. But now what this union is essentially doing is they're going to choose this single point of failure to really cripple America's international trade, at least when it comes to the East Coast ports on the Atlantic and on the Gulf.
And the West Coast ports are separate, correct? The West Coast ports have different representation. They're not affected by this.
Right, but what a lot of people have questioned is why can't we just ship everything in and out of the West Coast ports? I mean, those are just as clogged as the East Coast ones are. You can't simply just transfer all of that traffic. And there are also other logistical issues, like with the Panama Canal, for example. But even if that wasn't the case, we don't even have the rail infrastructure, for example, to transfer all of that traffic to the West Coast and then ship it all east.
All right, let me play some audio for you here. This is Harold Daggett. He's the head negotiator for the International Longshoreman Association. And he announced recently he's definitely playing hardball.
Everybody went to work during COVID. Nobody stayed home. Well, I want to be compensated for that. I'm not asking for the world. They know what I want. They know what I want. And if they don't, well, then I have to go into the street and we have to fight for what we rightfully deserve. These people today don't know what a strike is.
Right.
When my men hit the streets, from Maine to Texas, every single port will lock down. You know what's gonna happen? I'll tell you. First week, be all over the news every night, boom, boom. Second week, guys who sell cars can't sell cars because the cars ain't coming in off the ships. They get laid off. Third week, malls start closing down. They can't get the goods from China. They can't sell clothes. They can't do this. Everything in the United States comes on a ship. They go out of business. Construction workers get laid off because the materials aren't coming in. The steel's not coming in. The lumber's not coming in. They lose their job. Everybody's hating the longshoremen now because now they realize how important our jobs are.
EJ Antoni, is Harold Daggett accurately describing the economic turmoil that will come?
I think that's pretty close, Vince. Yeah, unfortunately. And you know what? This is actually something that I think longtime listeners of your show kind of would have probably seen coming because we talked about this back in October of 2021 when we were talking about the Biden-Harris administration, the massive amount of spending that they were doing just in the first half year of their administration and all of the inflation it was going to cause and the subsequent strikes that were going to happen because of that. And then a couple of years after that, in October of 2023, we were talking again about the United Auto Workers Union. That at the time was the largest auto strike in American history. And it's all because these laborers are essentially demanding higher wages because of the massive cost of living increase that we have seen over the last several years. And this is very, very common whenever you have these periods of very high and very rapid inflation. Workers are very upset about the fact that they can no longer make ends meet, about the fact that they may be making more, but their paycheck buys less than it used to. And the individual worker may not have a lot of bargaining power, but when you have collective bargaining power, as is the case of these unions, that's where you really start to see the wage pressure ramp up.
So I'm looking at some of the numbers here, and it strikes me that the longshoremen, by and large, seem to be pretty well paid by comparison to most American jobs. They say longshoreman income can, on an annual basis, exceed $200,000 a year. Longshoremen, under the current contract that expires today, earn about $39 an hour at their top rate. The Longshoreman Association wants a $5 an hour raise for each of the next 6 years, which will put them at $69 at the top rate per hour in the final year of the contract. So they're making some big asks here, but it looks like the longshoremen do kind of have a legitimate labor monopoly going on the East Coast.
They certainly do, absolutely. And, you know, those types of monopolies are one of the reasons why, you know, government can step in and say, no, you're going back to work and everyone's going back to the negotiating table, at least for a limited period of time. You know, but I don't want to, going back to something we said earlier, I don't want to just make it seem like all these guys want, at least leadership, all they want is simply cost of living increases. There are also some pretty crazy demands that leadership is making, which frankly, I don't think are really serving the best interests of the members here. One of the things is this incredible resistance to automation. And at first you may say, well, of course, resist automation because that'll eliminate jobs. Sure, it eliminates certain jobs, but it also creates others. You know, there was a lot of resistance, for example, when they started automating toll booths. Well, guess what happened after that? Instead of having to sit in these booths, which were not climate controlled, where these toll workers were breathing car exhaust all day, making change for people, working literally 24 hours a day. Now we have, in most states, a system where it's all electronic, and a lot of those folks ended up getting jobs simply doing things like answering phones in an air-conditioned office essentially handling help requests from people with their Easy Pass or
Right.
whatever electronic tolling system it may be. So far from eliminating these people's jobs, it actually ended up giving them better ones.
So I'm going to play one more piece of audio from Harold Daggett, and then I want to talk about Joe Biden's role in all of this because you alluded to it a moment ago. Here's one more from Harold Daggett. Again, he's the chief negotiator, the president of the International Longshoremen's Association. He says that Joe Biden has now been screaming at him. I haven't heard Joe Biden. I guess Biden does scream occasionally. He'll just scream and then I'll go back to whispering. It's kind of crazy. So I guess Harold Daggett experienced one of the screaming moments.
Now I have the president screaming at me. I'm putting a Taft-Hartley on you. Go ahead. Taft-Hartley means I have to go back to work for 90 days. That's a cooling off period. Do you think when I go back for 90 days, those men are going to go to work on that pier? It's going to cost the companies money to pay their salaries. Well, they went from 30 moves an hour maybe to 8. They're going to be like this. Who's going to win here in the long run? You're better off sitting down and let's get a contract and let's move on with this world. And in today's world, I'll cripple you. I will cripple you, and you have no idea what that means. Nobody does.
I will cripple you. You have no idea what that means. This guy, unbelievable. So that's who's staring down Joe Biden right now, telling him, go ahead, invoke Taft-Hartley. Now let's talk about Biden for a moment, EJ Antoni. The Taft-Hartley Act will allow Biden to force everybody back to work for a period of 80 days. Is that right?
Right, exactly. But this is really just a Band-Aid. It's not something that is going to, I think, ultimately solve the problem here, unfortunately. And it's very similar to when we had the big rail strike not that long ago. That was just 2 years ago, right? And we saw the government intervene essentially to stop that and prevent what would have been an even more massive amount of economic harm, because that would have shut down not just simply freight entering and exiting the East Coast ports, but freight moving essentially nationwide. I mean, unfortunately, we really are in a bit of a no-win situation here. I think we're probably going to ultimately see, some kind of bargain where the ports are not going to get everything they want, the union is not going to get everything they want, and unfortunately, the American taxpayer, right, the American consumer is going to be the one holding the bag and paying for these higher costs.
So I want to just explore the politics of this, and I know you're doing the economics of all of this. But there are some interesting things going on. One of them is that Biden is trying to curry favor with the unions and make himself seem like Lunch Bucket Joe. He's in an impossible political situation here because if he lets this go through and a strike takes place, you're looking at complete economic turmoil ahead of the election. And then simultaneously, if he calls off the strike by invoking Taft-Hartley, well, then he's betraying the unions that he claims to be in the corner of. The unions themselves, the Longshoremen are an affiliate of the AFL-CIO, and the AFL-CIO has openly endorsed Kamala Harris for president already. So what I'm looking at here, EJ Antoni, is a very messy political environment, and I'm still waiting to hear what President Trump is going to say on this subject because he's obviously going to have an immense amount of interest in getting everything back on track.
Yeah, Vince, I think that's absolutely right. And, one of the really interesting things here that you're alluding to is the fact that we are so close to this election. And essentially, you're looking at a situation where if Biden does go all in for the unions and essentially lets the strike go forward, then 4 weeks from now, when we're right before the election, you will have consumers at that point being unable to buy a lot of the things that they're used to being able to just run to the store and grab really easy, or they're used to be able to just buy it with one click on like Amazon.com or whatever the case may be. So I don't think there really is a way for Biden to square the circle right now. And if we just look at it from a numbers perspective, the polling in terms of union members, not the leadership, I don't care about them, but the actual hardworking union members, their approval rating of this administration is pretty lousy, and they like Trump much more than they have liked any Republican in literally decades. That's not an exaggeration. So again, I just don't think there's a way for Biden to square this circle right now.
Yeah, and this is quite obviously why the union contract runs through today. That's why. I mean, if you were to schedule this thing, you try and schedule it right up against a major presidential election so that you have the most possible bargaining power heading into those final weeks ahead of the election. And now we're seeing the fruits of that effort to set the contract for this very timeline. Well, we'll keep tracking it. EJ Antoni, we'll talk to you again, as we always do, on the state of the economy. Thank you, sir.